beauty, welcome back to my channel. Today we're back to continue our read along of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. We've been reading aloud chapters of this book, and the previous videos have been linked in the playlist. They're in the description box down below. So if you're new to the series and you'd like to start with chapter 1, go ahead, click the playlist and start there. Otherwise, we're going to continue. Today we're up to chapter 22, which in this edition begins on page 165. So I'm going to read aloud, and if you have a copy of the book, why don't you read along with me or just listen. Chapter 22. The wind blew over the roof and ruffled the shingles. It whistled sharp under the closed door. The chimney made fearful sounds of protest as it was invaded by the urgent gusts. A mile away, old Kansas City Kate, the train much admired but too important to stop in stamps, crashed through the middle of town, blew its woo-wee warnings, and continued to an unknown glamorous destination without looking back. There was going to be a storm, and it was a perfect night for reading Jane Eyre. Bailey had finished his chores and was already behind the stove with Mark Twain. It was my turn to close the store, and my book, half read, lay on the candy counter. Since the weather was going to be bad, I was sure Uncle Willie would agree. In fact, encouraged me to close early, save electricity, and join the family in Mama's bedroom, which functioned as our sitting room. Few people would be out in weather that threatened a tornado, for though the wind blew, the sky was as clear and still as a summer morning. Mama agreed that I might as well close, and I went out on the porch, closed the shutters, slipped the wooden bar over the door, and turned off the light. Pots rattled in the kitchen where Mama was frying corn cakes to go with vegetable soup for supper, and the homey sounds and scents cushioned me as I read of Jane Eyre in the cold English mansion of a colder English gentleman. Uncle Willie was engrossed in the almanac, his nightly reading, and my brother was far away on a raft on the Mississippi. I was the first to hear the rattle on the back door, a rattle and knock and rattle. But suspecting that it might have been the mad wife in the tower, I didn't credit it. Then Uncle Willie heard it and summoned Bailey back from Huck Finn to unlatch the bolt. Through the open door, the moonshine fell into the room in a cold radiance to rival our meager lamplight. We all waited. I with a dread expectancy, for no human being was there. The wind alone came in, struggling with the weak flame in the coal oil lamp, pushing and bunting about the family warmth of our pot-bellied stove. Uncle Willie thought it must have been the storm and told Bailey to close the door. But just before he secured the raw wooden slab, a voice drifted through the crack. It wheezed. "Sister Henderson, Brother Willie." Bailey nearly closed the door again, but Uncle Willie asked, "Who is it?" And Mr. George Taylor's pinched brown face swam out of the gray and into view. He assured himself that we hadn't gone to bed and was welcomed in. When Mama saw him, she invited him to stay for supper and told me to stick some sweet potatoes in the ashes to stretch the evening meal. Poor Brother Taylor had been taking meals all over town ever since he buried his wife in the summer. Maybe due to the fact that I was in my romanticist period, or because children have a built-in survival apparatus, I feared he was interested in marrying Mama and moving in with us. Uncle Willie cradled the almanac in his divided lap. "You're welcome here any time, Brother Taylor, any time, but this is a bad night. It's there right here." With his crippled hand, he wrapped the almanac. "That November 12th, a storm going to be moving over stamps out of the east. A rough night." Mr. Taylor remained exactly in the same position he had taken when he arrived, like a person too cold to readjust his body even to get closer to the fire. His neck was bent, and the red light played over the polished skin of his hairless head, but his eyes bound me with a unique attraction. They sat deep in his little face and completely dominated the other features with a roundness which seemed to be outlined in dark pencil, giving him an owlish appearance. And when he sensed my regarding him so steadily, his head hardly moved, but his eyes swirled and landed on me. If his look had contained contempt or patronage, or any of the vulgar emotions revealed by adults in confrontation with children, I would have easily gone back to my book. But his eyes gave off a watery nothing, a nothingness which was completely unbearable. I saw a glassiness observed before only in new marbles or a bottle top embedded in a block of ice. His glance moved so swiftly from me, it was nearly impossible to imagine that I had in fact imagined the interchange. But as I say, you're welcome. We can always make a place under this roof. Uncle Willie didn't seem to notice that Mr. Taylor was oblivious to everything he said. Mama brought the soup into the room, took the kettle off the heater, and placed the steaming pot on the fire. Uncle Willie continued. Mama, I told Brother Taylor he's welcome here anytime. Mama said, that's right, Brother Taylor. You're not supposed to sit around that lonely house feeling sorry for yourself. The Lord give it and the Lord take it away. I'm not sure whether it was Mama's presence or the bubbling soup on the stove which influenced him, but Mr. Taylor appeared to have livened up considerably. He shook his shoulders as if shaking off a tiresome touch and attempted a smile that failed. Sister Henderson, I sure appreciate. I don't know what I'd do if it wasn't for everybody. You don't know what it's worth to me to be able to, I'm thankful. At each pause, he pecked his head over his chest like a turtle coming out of its shell, but his eyes didn't move. Mama, always self-conscious at public displays of emotions not traceable to a religious source, told me to come with her and we'd bring the bread and bowls. She carried the food and I trailed after her, bringing the kerosene lamp. The new light set the room in an eerie, harsh perspective. Bailey still sat, doubled over his book, a black, hunchbacked gnome, a finger forerunning his eyes along the page. Uncle Willie and Mr. Taylor were frozen like people in a book on the history of the American Negro. Now come on, Brother Taylor. Mama was pressing a bowl of soup on him. You may not be hungry, but take this for nourishment. Her voice had the tender concern of a healthy person speaking to an invalid, and her plain statement rang thrillingly true. I'm thankful. Bailey came out of his absorption and went to wash his hands. Willie, say the blessing. Mama set Bailey's bowl down and bowed her head. During grace, Bailey stood in the doorway, a figure of obedience, but I knew his mind was on Tom Sawyer and Jim, as mine would have been on Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, but for the glittering eyes of wizened old Mr. Taylor. Our guest dutifully took a few spoonfuls of soup and bit a semicircle in the bread, then put his bowl on the floor. Something in the fire held his attention as we ate noisily. Noting his withdrawal, Mama said, It don't do for you to take on, so I know you all was together a long time. Uncle Willie said, 40 years. But it's been around 6 months since she's gone to her rest, and you got to keep faith. He never gives us more than we can bear. The statement heartened Mr. Taylor. He picked up his bowl again and raked his spoon through the thick soup. Mama saw that she had made some contact, so she went on. You had a whole lot of good years. Got to be grateful for them. Only thing is, it's a pity y'all didn't have some children. If my head had been down, I would have missed Mr. Taylor's metamorphosis. It was not a change that came by steps, but rather it seemed to me of a sudden. His bowl was on the floor with a thud and his body leaned toward Mama from the hips. However, his face was the most striking feature of all. The brown expanse seemed to darken with life, as if an inner agitation played under his thin skin. The mouth, open to show the long teeth, was a dark room furnished with a few white chairs. Children, he gumballed the word around in his empty mouth. Yes, sir, children. Bailey and I used to be addressed so, looked at him expectantly. That's what she want. His eyes were vital and straining to jump from the imprisoning sockets. That's what she said, children. The air was weighted and thick. A bigger house had been set on our roof and was imperceptibly pushing us into the ground. Mama asked in her nice folks voice. What who said, Brother Taylor? She knew the answer. We all knew the answer. Florida. His little wrinkled hands were making fists, then straightening, then making fists again. She said it just last night. Bailey and I looked at each other, and I hunched my chair closer to him, said, I want some children. When he pitched his already high voice to what he considered a feminine level, or at any rate to his wife's, Miss Florida's level, it streaked across the room, zigzagging like lightning. Uncle Willie had stopped eating and was regarding him with something like pity. Maybe he was dreaming, Brother Taylor. Could have been a dream. Mama came in placatingly. That's right. You know, the children was reading me something the other day. Said folks dream about whatever was on their mind when they went to sleep. Mr. Taylor jerked himself up. It was not no dream. I was as wide awake as I am this very minute. He was angry, and the tension increased his little mask of strength. I'll tell you what happened. Oh, Lord, a ghost story. I hated and dreaded the long winter nights when late customers came to the store to sit around the heater roasting peanuts and trying to best each other in telling lurid tales of ghosts and haunts, banshees and juju, voodoo and other anti-life stories. But a real one that happened to a real person, and last night, it was going to be intolerable. I got up and walked to the window. Mrs. Florida Taylor's funeral in June came on the heels of our final exams. Bailey and Louise and I had done very well and were pleased with ourselves and each other. The summer stretched golden in front of us, with promises of picnics and fish fries, blackberry hunts, and croquet games till dark. It would have taken a personal loss to penetrate my sense of well-being. I had met and loved the Bronte sisters and had replaced Kipling's If with Invictus. My friendship with Louise was solidified over Jack's hopscotch and confessions, deep and dark, exchanged often after many a cross your heart you won't tell. I never talked about St. Louis to her and had generally come to believe that the nightmare with its attendant guilt and fear hadn't really happened to me. It happened to a nasty little girl years and years before who had no chain on me at all. At first, the news that Mrs. Taylor was dead did not strike me as a particularly newsy bit of information. As children do, I thought that since she was very old, she had only one thing to do, and that was to die. She was a pleasant enough woman, with her steps made mincing by age and her little hands like gentle claws that liked to touch young skin. Each time she came to the store, I was forced to go up to her while she raked her yellow nails down my cheeks. "You sure got a pretty complexion." It was a rare compliment in a world of very few such words of praise, so it balanced being touched by the dry fingers. "You going to the funeral, sister?" Mama wasn't asking a question. Mama said, "You going because Sister Taylor thought so much of you she left you her yellow brooch." She wouldn't say gold because it wasn't. She told Brother Taylor, "I want Sister Henderson's grandbaby to have my gold brooch, so you'll have to go." I had followed a few coffins up the hill from the church to the cemetery, but because Mama said I was tender-hearted, I had never been forced to sit through a funeral service. At 11 years old, death is more unreal than frightening. It seemed a waste of a good afternoon to sit in church for a silly old brooch, which was not only not gold, but it was too old for me to wear. But if Mama said I had to go, it was certain that I would be there. The mourners on the front benches sat in a blue serge, black crepe dress gloom. A funeral hymn made its way around the church tediously but successfully. It eased into the heart of every gay thought, into the care of each happy memory. Shattering the light and hopeful, on the other side of Jordan there is a peace for the weary, there is a peace for me. The inevitable destination of all living things seemed but a short step away. I had never considered before that dying, death, dead, passed away were words and phrases that might be even faintly connected with me. But on that onerous day, oppressed beyond relief, my own mortality was borne in upon me on sluggish tides of doom. No sooner had the mournful song run its course than the minister took to the altar and delivered a sermon that in my state gave little comfort. Its subject was, "Thou art my good and faithful servant, with whom I am well pleased." His voice weaved itself through the somber vapors led by the dirge. In a monotonous tone, he warned the listeners that this day might be your last, and the best insurance against dying a sinner was to make yourself right with God, so that on the fateful day he would say, "Thou art my good and faithful servant, with whom I am well pleased." After he had put the fear of the cold grave under our skins, he began to speak of Mrs. Taylor, a godly woman who gave to the poor, visited the sick, tithed to the church, and in general lived a life of goodliness. At this point, he began to talk directly to the coffin, which I had noticed upon my arrival and had studiously avoided thereafter. "I hungered, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you left me not. Inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of one of these, you have done it unto me." He bounded off the dais and approached the velvet gray box. With an imperious gesture, he snatched the gray cloth off the open flap and gazed downward into the mystery. "Sleep on, thy graceful soul, till Christ calls you to come forth into his bright heaven." He continued speaking directly to the dead woman, and I half wished she would rise up and answer him, offended by the coarseness of his approach. A scream burst from Mr. Taylor. He stood up suddenly and lengthened his arms toward the minister, the coffin, and his wife's corpse. For a long minute he hovered, his back to the church, as the instructive words kept falling around the room, rich with promise, full with warnings. Mama and other ladies caught him in time to bring him back to the bench, where he quickly folded upon himself like a Burr-Rabbit rag doll. Mr. Taylor and the high church officials were the first to file around the bier to wave farewell to the departed and get a glimpse of what lay in store for all men. Then, on heavy feet made more ponderous by the guilt of the living viewing the dead, the adult church marched up to the coffin and back to their seats. Their faces, which showed apprehension before reaching the coffin, revealed on the way down the opposite aisle a final confirmation of their fears. Watching them was a little like peeping through a window when the shade is not drawn flush. Although I didn't try, it was impossible not to record their roles in the drama. And then, a black-dressed usher stuck her hand out woodenly toward the children's rows. There was the shifty rustling of unreadiness, but finally, a boy of 14 led us off, and I dared not hang back, as much as I hated the idea of seeing Mrs. Taylor. Up the aisle, the moans and screams merged with the sickening smell of woolen black clothes worn in summer weather and green leaves wilting over yellow flowers. I couldn't distinguish whether I was smelling the clutching sound of misery or hearing the clawing odor of death. It would have been easier to see her through the gauze, but instead, I looked down on a stark face that seemed suddenly so empty and evil. It knew secrets that I never wanted to share. The cheeks had fallen back to the ears, and a solicitous mortician had put lipstick on the black mouth. The scent of decay was sweet and clasping. It groped for life with a hunger both greedy and hateful, but it was hypnotic. I wanted to be off, but my shoes had glued themselves to the floor, and I had to hold on to the sides of the coffin to remain standing. The unexpected halt in the moving line caused the children to press upon each other, and whispers of no small intent reached my ears. "Move along, sister, move along." It was Mama. Her voice tugged at my will, and someone pushed from the rear, so I was freed. Instantly, I surrendered myself to the grimness of death. The change it had been able to effect in Mrs. Taylor showed that its strength could not be resisted. Her high-pitched voice, which parted the air in the store, was forever stilled, and the plump brown face had been deflated and patted flat, like a cow's odorous dropping. The coffin was carried on a horse-drawn wagon to the cemetery, and all the way I communed with death's angels, questioning their choice of time, place, and person. For the first time, the burial ceremony had meaning for me. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. It was certain that Mrs. Taylor was returning to the earth from whence she came. In fact, upon considering, I concluded that she had looked like a mud baby lying on the white satin of her velvet coffin. A mud baby, molded into form by creative children on a rainy day, soon to run back into the loose earth. The memory of the grim ceremony had been so real to me that I was surprised to look up and see Mama and Uncle Willie eating by the stove. They were neither anxious nor hesitant, as if they knew a man has to say what he has to say. But I didn't want to hear any of it, and the wind, allying itself with me, threatened the chinaberry tree outside the back door. Last night, after I said my prayers, I lay down on the bed. Well, you know it's the same bed she died on. Oh, if he'd shut up, Mama said. "Sister, sit down and eat your soup. Cold night like this, you need something hot in your stomach. Go on, Brother Taylor, please." I sat down as near Bailey as possible. Well, something told me to open my eyes. "What kind of something?" Mama asked, not laying down her spoon. "Yes, sir," Uncle Willie explained. "There can be a good something and there can be a bad something." Well, I wasn't sure, so I figured better open them, because it could have been, well, either one. I did, and the first thing I saw, little baby Angel. It was just as fat as a butterball and laughing, eyes blue, blue, blue. Uncle Willie asked, "A baby angel?" "Yes, sir, and it was laughing right in my face, and I heard this long moan. Well, as you say, Sister Henderson, we've been together over 40 years. I know Florida's voice. I wasn't scared right then. I called, 'Florida.' Then that angel laughed harder, and the moan got louder. I set my bowl down and got closer to Bailey. Mrs. Taylor had been a very pleasant woman, smiling all the time and patient. The only thing that jarred and bothered me when she came in the store was her voice. Like near-deaf people, she screamed, half not hearing what she was saying and partly hoping her listeners would reply in kind. That was when she was living. The thought of that voice coming out of the grave and all the way down the hill from the cemetery and hanging over my head was enough to straighten my hair. "Yes, sir," he was looking at the stove, and the red glow fell on his face. It seemed as if he had a fire going on inside his head. First I called, "Florida, Florida, what do you want?" And that devilish angel kept on laughing to beat the band. Mr. Taylor tried to laugh and only succeeded in looking frightened. "I want some." That's when she said, "I want some." He made his voice sound like the wind, if the wind had bronchial pneumonia. He wheezed, "I want some children." Bailey and I met halfway on the drafty floor. Mama said, "Now, Brother Taylor, could be you was dreaming. You know they say whatever you goes to bed with on your mind." "No, ma'am, Sister Henderson." I was as wide awake as I am right now. "Did she let you see her?" Uncle Willie had a dreamy look on his face. No, Willie, all I seed was that fat little white baby angel, but wasn't no mistake in that voice. I want some children. The cold wind had frozen my feet and my spine. Mr. Taylor's impersonation had chilled my blood. Mama said, "Sister, go bring the long fork to take the potatoes out." Ma'am? Surely she didn't mean the long fork that hung on the wall behind this kitchen stove, a scary million miles away. I said, "Go get the fork. The potatoes are burning." I unwound my legs from the gripping fear and almost tripped onto the stove. Mama said, "That child would stumble over the pattern in a rug. Go on, Brother Taylor." Did she say any more? I didn't want to hear it if she did, but I wasn't eager to leave the lighted room where my family sat around the friendly fire. Well, she said a few more times, and then that angel started to walk off the ceiling. I tell you, I was pert near scared stiff. I had reached the no man's ocean of darkness. No great decision was called for. I knew it would be torturous to go through the thick blackness of Uncle Willie's bedroom, but it would be easier than staying around to hear the ghoulish story. Also, I couldn't afford to aggravate Mama. When she was displeased, she made me sleep on the edge of the bed, and that night, I knew I needed to be close to her. 1 foot into the darkness, and the sense of detachment from reality nearly made me panic. The idea came to me that I might never get out into the light again. Quickly, I found the door leading back to the familiar, but as I opened it, the awful story reached out and tried to grab my ears. I closed the door. Naturally, I believed in haints and ghosts and thanks. Having been raised by a super religious southern Negro grandmother, it would have been abnormal had I not been superstitious. The trip to the kitchen and back could not have taken more than 2 minutes, yet in that time I tramped through swampy cemeteries, climbed over dusty gravestones, and eluded litters of night black cats. Back in the family circle, I remarked to myself how like a cyclopean eye was the belly of the red-hot stove. It reminded me of the time when my daddy died. You know, we were very close. Mr. Taylor had hypnotized himself into the eerie world of horrors. I broke into his reminiscences. "Mama, here's the fork." Bailey had lain down on his side behind the stove and his eyes were shining. He was more fascinated with Mr. Taylor's morbid interest in his story than with the tale itself. Mama put her hand on my arm and said, "You shaken, sister? What's the matter?" My skin still rippled from the experience of fear. Uncle Willie laughed and said, "Maybe she was scared to go into the kitchen." His high little laugh didn't fool me. Everyone was uneasy at being beckoned into the unknown. "No, sir, I ain't never seen nothing so clear as that little angel baby." His jaws were scissoring mechanically on the already mushy sweet potatoes. "Just laughing like a house on fire. What you reckon it means, Sister Henderson?" Mama had reared back in her rocking chair, a half smile on her face. "If you're sure you wasn't dreaming, Brother Taylor." I was as wide awake as I am. He was becoming angry again. "As I am right now." "Well, then maybe it means I ought to know when I'm asleep and when I'm awake. Maybe it means Sister Florida wants you to work with the children in the church." One thing I always used to tell Florida: people won't let you get your words in edgewise. Could be she's trying to tell you, I ain't crazy, you know. My mind's just as good as it was to take a Sunday school class. 30 years ago, if I said I was awake when I saw that little fat angel, then people ought to. Sunday school needs more teachers. Lord knows that so. Believe me when I say so. Their remarks and responses were like a ping-pong game, with each volley clearing the net and flying back to the opposition. The sense of what they were saying became lost, and only the exercise remained. The exchange was conducted with the certainty of a measured hold-down, and had the jerkiness of Monday's wash snapping in the wind, now cracking east and west, with only the intent to whip the dampness out of the cloth. Within a few minutes, the intoxication of doom had fled, as if it had never been, and Mama was encouraging Mr. Taylor to take in one of the Jenkins boys to help him with his farm. Uncle Willie was nodding at the fire, and Bailey had escaped back to the calm adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The change in the room was remarkable. Shadows which had lengthened and darkened over the bed in the corner had disappeared or revealed themselves as dark images of familiar chairs and such. The light which dashed on the ceiling steadied and imitated rabbits rather than lions, and donkeys instead of ghouls. I laid a pallet for Mr. Taylor in Uncle Willie's room and crawled under Mama, who I knew for the first time was so good and righteous. She could command the fretful spirits as Jesus had commanded the sea. Peace, be still. And that's chapter 22. This was a pretty long chapter, but thanks for being here. Thanks for reading it along with me. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I'd love for you to continue watching my videos. This book ends on chapter 36, and I'm looking forward to you being here for the rest of this read along. So let's talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.